Hi class, this brief video is going to be on J.J.C. Smart's article on what he calls extreme and restricted utilitarianism and why he thinks that one is better than the other. So first of all, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, he just uses non-standard terminology. What he calls extreme utilitarianism is nowadays called Act Utilitarianism. And what he calls restricted utilitarianism is known as rule utilitarianism. He also introduces the hedonic versus idealist distinction that we discussed in the last video. Note he says hedonist instead of hedonic. I try to avoid that because hedonism is an ethical view in and of itself. So, very briefly, he's going to be arguing in favor of act utilitarianism. So, so he makes all the distinctions in section 1. Remember that the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism is really what we're evaluating. So, do we base our actions on the utility of those actions, or do we base our actions on the rules that have the most utility? So, are we calculating the utility of the rules? Are we calculating the utility of the actions? Those are two different things. Somebody can't say both. Having said that, in section 2, Smart points out why rules can, especially utility-based rules, can be quite useful. And I want to be careful here. Just because an act utilitarian uses some of these rules, that doesn't mean they're being inconsistent. That does not make them a rule utilitarian, because really it's about what actually makes an act right or wrong. Is it the utility calculus of the act or the utility calculus of the rule? Going along with that, another way you could think of the difference, remember I mentioned last video that act and rule utilitarians are going to agree on how to act 99% of the time. And so really you could think of the difference between act and rule utilitarians as, what do we do in that other 1%? The act utilitarian says, do a utility calculus, calculate and follow the act that increases utility, whereas the rule utilitarian is going to say, no, follow the rule whose general following would increase utility. So, two different ways of parsing out the difference between those two. But why might an act utilitarian do rules? He gives 3 important reasons why rules are useful, but useful isn't the same as determining right and wrong. So first of all, he points out they can be used as rules of thumb, they're commonly followed, and good general guidelines. 2, rules are just time savers. If we know a general rule of action that generally increases utility, then we don't have to do a gigantic utility calculus Bentham style for each and every action. And so the amount of time available makes the appeal to rules nice as well. He also mentions that when we're computing calculations at the point of action, we are very likely to become biased, especially if our own utility is part of the mix, and so rules are a good way to minimize bias. And then lastly, you might think I gave 4. I gave 3 reasons why they're good rules of thumb. Lastly is that cultivating the habit of following rules might be good for non-philosophers. So this is going to sound maybe condescending a little, but let's pause before we say this and say, look, ethics is a hard discipline. People get PhDs in ethics. Ethics can and does often require expertise. And so there's nothing wrong with saying, just like in the sciences or anywhere else, well, a lot of times the experts know more than the laypersons, and pretty much always they do in their chosen discipline. And so the third reason is to say, well, if you're not an ethicist, you might not be qualified to be doing the right kind of utility calculus to figure out how you should be acting. And so it might be better to just follow the general rules that have been provided by an ethicist. And so those are reasons we might use rules. Now, having said that, that's reasons we use rules. That's not reasons to think rules determine how I should act or what's right and what's wrong. That is our normative ethics or our meta-ethics. So, on to section 3, let's talk about why rule utilitarianism doesn't get us there. His really big point is that rules don't justify his really big point overall is why would we use rules when we know the rule doesn't get the right answer? He gives this with the 99% example. Well, if I know a principle gets the right answer 99% of the time, I might be justified in using that principle. Overall, sure. But what if I'm in a situation where I know the rule doesn't apply? Why would I use the rule anyway? And he gives the examples of the star charts and the navigations. Well, if I know this method doesn't get the right answer, and I know there's a more complicated method that does get the right answer, i.e. Act Utilitarianism, then it seems like we should be doing that. And so there's this collapse of rule utilitarianism into Act Utilitarianism. More generally, it's not the rule that justifies my action. So if I am performing an act where I know I'm following the rule that doesn't get the right answer, you don't seem justified in doing that. That's not a good reason to say I did X when a rule tells me to do X and that rule doesn't work here. And so those are kind of the two connected big reasons that he thinks we should be Act rather than rule utilitarians. We don't use rules and we shouldn't use rules when we know they don't apply, whereas Act Utilitarianism can effectively always apply. And the rule is not what justifies how you act. So those are his big arguments against rule utilitarianism. Since we're only reading reading that is in favor of Act Utilitarianism, let me mention kind of two things in favor of rule utilitarianism, kind of as a rebuttal to SMART. So again, a good discussion board topic. Is it better to be an Act or rule utilitarian, and why? First of all, a rule utilitarian is going to say some of these examples he uses are way off because rules are much more complex than he gives credit for. I have never heard a rule utilitarian defend the rule "don't lie." That's crazy. Just think of some of these silly examples. Well, if you're in Nazi Germany in World War II and you're harboring Jews and the SS officer asks, "Are you harboring Jews?" Of course you're going to lie. And every utilitarian is going to say you should lie there, rule or act. And so the desert island example where the person dies and bequeaths his money to the horse thing, I'm not aware of a rule utilitarian, who would necessarily be defending that action to begin with. And it's a little tricky because SMART does exactly what we shouldn't do. He doesn't identify what rule is being upheld. So remember, rules are the form when X I will lie. So they wouldn't be when someone asks me a question, I will always tell the truth. That is not a rule of rule utilitarianism. It would be something like when someone asks me a question and there's no extreme considerations weighing against it, and it meets social protocol of a certain sort, and it generally doesn't do massive amounts of harm, then I will tell the truth. And so rule utilitarians are going to be a little more lawyerly in their when X portion than maybe SMART gives them credit for. So that's thing one. Thing two, it might also be said that SMART really kind of underplays the bias thing. Because a criticism of Act Utilitarianism is that you can never do a full utility calculus at the point of action. That the way we live our lives is such that we simply cannot calculate all utility before we make any of our everyday decisions. And so if you start with that as a presupposition, then the rule utilitarian has the following advantage. Well, we don't try to do our utility calculus at the point of action. We do our ethics at the library. We do our ethics when we could look at all the data, when we could do our research, when we can actually perform the utility calculus. We do that at the library and generate our rules because we know that we simply can't do that kind of calculus at the point of action. And so if you think that's a good thing, you might be more inclined towards rule utilitarianism as well. So again, the two kind of rule utilitarian rebuttals. One, rules are a lot more complicated than Smart seems to make them, and we need to know what those rules are if we're able to really need to worry about the 99% rule. So is it 99% of the time it works or 99.9999% of the time it works? More importantly, when the rule fails, is it obvious that it's a failure and obvious that I know what to do, or is it I have no idea what to do here? Because if it's the latter, it seems like it makes perfect sense to just follow the rule that generally works if I'm not sure if it's going to work or not, and I don't have a better alternative. So those are two things that one might say on behalf of the rule utilitarian, and I just wanted to get those out there because, again, we only do this one reading instead of a reading for both positions. So love to hear your thoughts on whether we should be act or rule utilitarians. Next time we're going to shift to Mill. So remember, Mill is best interpreted as an idealist rule utilitarian. We've talked a lot about rule utilitarianism generally. We've talked about rule utilitarianism now a little bit. So mostly next time we're going to focus on the idealist utilitarian and what to do with that. So one thing you really want to watch for in your readings is one, well, there's going to be a couple things. One, why does he think that moral rationalism fails? We're going to talk some about that. That is why I think ethics isn't like math and it has to focus on experience like utilitarianism does. Two, we're going to watch for his arguments, well, why should we be utilitarians generally? But most importantly, three, what is his argument for idealist utilitarianism? Because remember, the utilitarian's making a hard claim here. The utilitarian says ethics is like science. It's observable, quantifiable, measurable, observable, predictable. And yet, the idealist utilitarian adds, and some goods are incomparably different than others. Those two ideas don't play super well together, and so we're going to have a very nuanced account of how we cash that out exactly. And let me just tell you what to look for in the reading. John Stuart Mill is going to put this difference in terms of quantity versus quality of a good. So that's the language he's going to use. He's writing before idealist utilitarianism. So you want to watch for that. And more importantly, he can't just assert something like, oh, justice is incomparably better than BLTs, because that's abstract and a priori reasoning. He's going to have to say, no, it is quantifiably, observably, measurably better than the other. And so what Mill's going to do is give two tests as to how we could determine if a good is better in quality rather than just quantity. Now, the one tricky part, he says, there's but one way to determine, and then he gives two. So, set that aside. But we'll talk, that's the most important part of the Mill that we're really going to hit hard next lesson, so make sure to watch for that and find it in the reading, and probably even, we'll probably even look at some passages in the book as we're doing that lecture, so make sure to have your book sitting next to you for the Mill lecture. And we will see you next time.